We're moving into the lymphatic system. So it's another type of circulation for our body, along with the cardiovascular, now the lymphatic system. And moving into the functions for this system, we notice here, well, with the lymphatic system, there's the actual development of particular types of leukocytes, specifically the production and circulation of lymphocytes, one of the 5 types of leukocytes. And of course, they have their distinct immune function. So we'll talk a little bit about the cytology and different categories of lymphocytes, different types of lymphocytes. And another major function for the lymphatic system, tying it to the cardiovascular system, we're going to see that fluid, and we'll learn the exact name of this fluid here. But fluid that's lost from the capillaries, right, when plasma leaves out of the capillaries and goes into our tissues, that fluid spends a period of time in the lymphatic system, and then ultimately there's a pathway to lead back to the heart. So we'll see exactly where this fluid is recovered by the cardiovascular system. And this third bullet point, or this last one here, the fourth one, we're going to see how the lymphatic system has a direct relationship with our digestive system. So in the terms of any type of fat, any type of lipid material that we ingest in our diet, whether it's triglycerides or the various fat-soluble vitamins, these lipid structures first enter into the lymphatic system first before they enter into the digestive system. So lipids, fats have that additional step of passing through the lymphatic system. So this figure right here has the majority of the anatomy for the system. Anatomically, it's relatively simple. Few organs, but of course the importance is, of course, our immune system, our immunity. So we have a list of organs, just the major organs for the lymphatic system. So we'll go through, of course, the spleen, the thymus. We'll see the tonsils for lab. We'll learn the distinct clusters of lymph nodes. And it's these last two down here are found in the digestive tract. So these last two are found in the intestines. And again, just showing that relationship to the digestive system and the lymphatic system. So we'll start with a little bit of the cytology. So again, lymphocytes are one of the 5 types of leukocytes, or the common term, the white blood cells. And lymphocytes have their specific function in terms of immunity. So they have a very specific target. They're monitoring for a particular antigen that our cells are presenting, and we could detect those and, of course, start that immune response. So fighting off infection that's within our system. And we already know that these are one of the 5 leukocytes in our blood. And of course, you can see where the name of the system comes from. The lymphatic system has a large concentration of the various types of lymphocytes. And taking a look at that, we have the 3 categories of lymphocytes. So there's what's known as T cells, and that T, of course, stands for the thymus, the organ where they're produced. So the first examples, and this is a category in of itself, there's the thymus-dependent lymphocytes. Thymus-dependent or just simply T cells. There's now, of course, various now types of specific B cells that develop. So the bone marrow derived or just simply B cells. And then the least common of these 3 categories, but still important, the natural killer cells. So we'll start with the grouping of T cells, and then we'll move into B cells and finish up with just a very brief description of the natural killer cells. So again, each of these are now further divide it into specific types. So tackling the T cells, these are now, again, the most common type of lymphocyte, the principal cell of our immune system, of our lymphatic system. And it's the various T cells have the ability to target and detect infection that's within our tissues. So when a cell becomes infected, it's now the cytotoxic T cells that can now detect that infection in a cell and ultimately start the cascade of events to now respond to that infection. So it's triggering our immunity by detecting infection and ultimately trying to kill off that infected tissue and thus killing the infection. We also see that there's various types of T cells, helper and suppressor T cells. Again, these cells detect infection in our tissue, and whereas the cytotoxic T cell's job to try to kill off the infected cell, these helper and suppressor cells, again, they detect infection, but then they stimulate the activity of those bone marrow derived B cells. And in turn, the B cells then have their function, and we'll discuss that in just a moment. So you can see it's a cascade. Helper T cells detect infection, trigger another type of lymphocyte, and then the B cell has its own distinct function. And another example of a T cell grouping are these memory T cells. And it's truly this type here is how we build our immunity. So a description of how these memory T cells function is, the first time we're exposed to some infection, on that very initial first exposure, we become infected, and we could become quite sick and have like a duration of that disease symptom. But also at the same time, since we're exposed to it, we're developing these memory T cells specific to that distinct infection. So if sometime in the future, if we're ever exposed to that same or similar type of infection, we already now have this built-in immunity. So hopefully the second or third, the future time we're exposed to that infection, we now have that built-in immunity via the memory T cells. So maybe we don't get sick at all that next time, or maybe the symptoms are quite mild and our immune system could quickly fight it off. So this example of making memory T cells, this is really the concept behind making a vaccine. So we get our flu shot, for example, and that'll help us boost our immunity so that hopefully we can be protected for that flu season. However, you notice T cells themselves being a very important cell of our immune system, the T cells themselves are actually susceptible to infection, and that's the issue, of course, with HIV. It's truly a mutation and infection of these T cells. So that first line of our immunity. So now let's move on to the second category, the B cells. So we said stimulated by helper and suppressor T cells to do their job, and their function is to produce antibodies. So now we're able to produce a specific antibody that's developed by these B cells for a specific type of infection. So we could, of course, depending on what we're exposed to, what we're infected with, we can adapt and develop distinct antibodies to now try to target that infection. And again, the antibodies themselves are another key part of our immune system. And these antibodies, of course, are produced by the B cells and could circulate through our blood to target infected tissues. And then lastly, there's the natural killer cells. And again, you notice in such a low supply, but these natural killer cells, again, fight infection and even to a slight degree, try to fight the spread of cancer. And the complication with cancer spreading, it typically spreads through our lymphatic system. So cancerous cells enter in from one organ, passing through the lymphatic system, and that's typically the route how a cancer will metastasize or spread. And we have a natural cell to try to resist that. But keep in mind, it's such to a limited supply. So as far as the cell types, that's as far as we're going. And just want to remind you, all of our blood cells, erythrocytes, all types of leukocytes, platelets, originally formed from our bone marrow. So going on to produce the various types of leukocytes. However, one distinction is now those thymus-dependent lymphocytes, the T cells. They now travel from the bone marrow to the organ, the thymus. The thymus is an organ near the area of the larynx, just inferior to the area of the larynx, superior to the heart. And in this area of the thymus, this organ, this allows for the complete maturation and the complete development of T cells. And once completely matured, they then exit out of the organ and pass into our general circulation. So we started out describing how the lymphatic system's a second type of circulation for the body, whereas the cardiovascular system has blood in circulation. The lymphatic system has a fluid called lymph, and this is a second type of fluid connective tissue. So definitely a connective tissue and a fluid connective tissue. Both blood and lymph are. And these two fluid connective tissues, we're going to see that there's a similarity. So the lymph of our lymphatic system, the makeup, the ionic concentration, is in many respects similar to the fluid plasma portion of the blood. So not the entire blood sample, but just the plasma portion. And the major differences between blood, plasma, differences between the plasma and the lymph is truly the levels of nutrients. So our blood is more nutrient rich, whereas our lymph, of course, is nutrient deficient. And that's one of the principal differences. Our blood is the way of circulating and delivering nutrients to our cells. And by time this fluid passes to the lymphatic system, that nutrients, of course, have been consumed by the cells. So taking a look at this similarity, we'll really spell it out here. Why are these two fluids, lymph and plasma, similar? Well, again, the fluid portion of blood, the fluid portion as opposed to the formed elements, that's called plasma. And again, plasma has the ability to exit and flow out of our capillaries. So now as plasma is leaving the cardiovascular system and it goes into our tissues, delivering nutrition and oxygen to our cells, that fluid is now called interstitial fluid. So the fluid directly surrounding the cells within the tissue of our organs. The cells are consuming the nutrients, consuming the oxygen. And now the majority of this interstitial fluid gets pulled into the lymphatic system, gets absorbed. And now at this point, fluid's called lymph, passing through the lymphatic system. And then to complete the cycle, this lymph is going to pour back into our cardiovascular system. And now that fluid is now adding back to our plasma volume. So there's really just a transfer of fluid occurring between these three different regions. Plasma in the bloodstream, interstitial fluid directly in our tissues, and the lymph of our lymphatic system. And we'll follow the cycle. We'll follow the pathway through to see how that works. So starting with the lymphatic circulation, it begins at lymphatic capillaries. And the purpose of these lymphatic capillaries are, well, absorbing that interstitial fluid from our various organs. Any possible infection, even cancer again, that could be in our various tissues can get pulled into the lymphatic system. And a key note is there's a few areas that lack lymphatic capillaries: our bone marrow and what's known as the central nervous system. And the two organs of the central nervous system are our brain and our spinal cord. So the brain and the spinal cord do not have lymphatic capillaries. And we'll see in the Unit 5 that the central nervous system has its own distinct type of circulation. So two areas that lack lymphatic capillaries, and a specialized type of lymphatic capillary called the lacteal. This is located just in the intestines. And again, that final function we listed out for the system, the fat that's in our diet. So any type of fat, any type of lipid that's in our diet, that gets pulled first into the lacteal of our intestines. So transferred from our intestines, pulled into the lacteal. And now we have that fat passing through the lymphatic system, whereas other nutrients could be absorbed directly into our cardiovascular system. So again, we're at the beginning of the lymphatic system, and we'll just point out a lymphatic capillary here as opposed to a cardiovascular system capillary. So we already know cardiovascular system capillaries, and there's the different types. The plasma is diffusing out, and that's the way to deliver nutrients to the cells. So as that fluid plasma leaves out, it's now known as interstitial fluid, so directly within the tissue surrounding the cells. The majority of this interstitial fluid gets pulled into a lymphatic capillary. And now we have the production of this fluid called lymph. And now ultimately this lymph will circulate. So let's just start through this again. We're forming interstitial fluid, of course, here. So blood flows from the capillaries into the cells, and we've created interstitial fluid. Most of that interstitial fluid is now going to be transferred to the lymphatic capillary. So now we have that transfer interstitial fluid into the lymphatic capillary. A small degree of the fluid actually does return right back to the cardiovascular system right away, but the majority of that interstitial fluid flows into the lymphatic capillary and now passing along the lymphatic system. And then ultimately, the lymphatic system leads right into a vein. So at this point, the lymph is now pouring right back into the cardiovascular system. And the overall concept is we're losing plasma at the capillaries. So our cardiovascular system is losing some volume of plasma at the capillaries. But now that fluid is recovered right here at the veins. So in between those 2 points, the cardiovascular capillaries and the veins where that lymph pours back in, there's a network of lymphatic vessels that now circulate lymph. And the good news is many of the traits that we discussed about veins and their adaptation to circulate blood, many of those same traits of veins are seen in lymphatic vessels. So we discussed the 3 thin tunic layers. So those 3 thin tunic layers, very similar to veins. Veins in our appendages have valves. Well, all of our lymphatic vessels have valves, so to keep the lymph flowing one direction. We have the description of the surrounding, contracting, squeezing skeletal muscles to circulate blood through a vein, and the same applies to a lymphatic vessel. The force of breathing helps to pull that lymph and propel it through the vessels of our torso. So again, all of those traits we've already covered for veins, just being applied right here to lymphatic vessels once more. And just a quick look again. So we know that the arteries have the three thick tunic layers typically, and veins have their three thin, delicate layers. And you can see even more thinner and delicate the structure of the lymphatic vessels. And just a quick look at the valve structure. So once again, similar in structure to a vein. So ultimately, all of these lymphatic vessels found throughout the majority of the body, they're going to lead towards now what's known as a lymphatic duct. And we have a description here. There's a thoracic duct, also known as a left lymphatic duct. And this thoracic duct collects the majority of our lymph. And we'll describe that here in the text. And there's a great illustration. So you notice lymph from the areas inferior to the diaphragm. So right here, this is a large proportion of our body, all the area inferior to the diaphragm, but also superior to the diaphragm. However, only as the name implies, left lymphatic duct, only to the left side, superior to the diaphragm. So again, the majority of our body's lymph, everywhere below the diaphragm and the superior left side, most of the lymph is going to flow through this thoracic duct. So the remaining fragment, the right lymphatic duct, is just collecting lymph from that remaining area. So you notice superior to the diaphragm, and again, it's in the name, to the right side. So we have a description in the text, and I'll just skip to this picture right here if you notice. This is a nice illustration of that. So you can see all of the dark green area, the area inferior to the diaphragm, the superior left half, all of the lymph possibly created in that area is going to flow through the thoracic duct or left lymphatic duct as it's called. And then just the light green area, superior right portion, all of that lymph, the right arm, the right side of the chest, right side of the head, any lymph collected in those areas, it's going to circulate through that right lymphatic duct. And then we already see the next step, how each of the lymphatic duct structures is going to lead right into a subclavian vein. And that's the particular vein here where the lymph of our lymphatic system is draining back to the bloodstream, back to the cardiovascular system. And we just have that description here. So the two major lymphatic duct structures, they fuse and deliver lymph directly to those subclavian veins. So before we move on, just want to make a quick note about the transfer of that interstitial fluid. So from our cardiovascular system, again, we have the need for plasma to flow out and become interstitial fluid. So this would be the loss of plasma from the capillary. A small percentage of that interstitial fluid is then quickly reabsorbed back to the cardiovascular system. But since there's an overall increased amount of filtration, less absorption, overall, the capillaries are losing plasma overall. There's a net outflow. And again, the majority of that fluid that's filtered out of the cardiovascular system, the majority of that fluid now gets pulled into the lymphatic system. So we have a production, you notice a steady production of lymph on a daily basis. And the point is, interstitial fluid, we don't want to allow that to just build up and collect and collect. We want to pull it away from the tissue and pull it into the lymphatic system. So that excess water and material is going to be picked up by the lymphatic capillaries and carried away from that organ, carried away from that tissue. And then ultimately, as we already pointed out, is returned to the subclavian veins. So this is an example, of course, when it's working properly. However, just an illustration to show when we lose that proper function. So in this case, the plasma, of course, is being transferred to the tissue here. You see in the skin, there's the production of interstitial fluid. And here's an example where there's not the proper now lymphatic production. So interstitial fluids building and collecting as opposed to being transferred to the lymphatic system and lymph being circulated away from the tissue. And this is an example of what's called lymphedema. So that's swelling and distension of the tissues. So moving on now towards the major organs. And of course, here we are looking at a section of the intestines. And we want to take a close look at what's called the plica. Zooming in on the plica, there's the multiple protruding spikes known as villi. And an even closer look at a villus now puts us here. And we can see that within the villus, here's that distinct type of lymphatic capillary. The lacteal located in the intestines. And again, the purpose here is we're absorbing fatty material from our diet, and that fat's entering into the lymphatic system. It has to be processed by the liver, and we'll discuss this at a later point. And now we already know all of our lymph ultimately flows into a subclavian vein. So a fat has this additional step of being processed and transferred through the lymphatic system, through the liver, and then it could enter our bloodstream. Whereas amino acids, proteins, sugars do not have that additional step, so they do not require that additional step. So moving forward with now the remainder of the lymphatic organs, and just some examples, of course, whether we're looking at the tonsils, the spleen, lymph nodes. The lymphatic organs really come down to their collection of what's called nodules. And a lymphatic nodule is now a collection of various types of lymphocytes. So we already discussed T cells, B cells, natural killer cells, even other types of leukocytes. They're now clustered together within some organ. And just a simple example, our tonsils, these are now just clusters of lymphocytes embedded in the area of our pharynx, the area of our throat. We have lymphatic nodules embedded in the structure of our intestines. And that's the term specifically in our small intestines, in our ileum. They're called Peyer's patches. And the ileum is just one particular segment of the small intestines. So of course, the tonsils, as I was mentioning, so just embedded in the structure of our pharynx. And we'll point out the locations in lab, but here's just the different groupings. Going back to the view of the intestines, and a cluster of lymphocytes embedded in the wall of the intestines, specifically the ileum of the small intestines, can be known as a lymphoid nodule. It's just a simple name, or the eponym, name for a person, Peyer's patch. Lymph nodes. Once again, lymph nodes have a collection of lymphatic nodules. It appears here as these dark rings. So a lymph node itself is connected to the various lymphatic vessels. And the purpose is the lymphatic vessels are delivering lymph into a node. And you can notice there's multiple lymphatic vessels known as afferent vessels delivering lymph into the node, and then just a single lymphatic vessel carrying the lymph out. And now, as the lymph passes through the area of each node, it's being exposed to those nodules. The lymph is being exposed to a large concentration of white blood cells. And the goal is, hopefully, that we could fight off infection that's in this lymph fluid. So they're found all around the body. There's some on the neck that you commonly think of as being swollen, being a sign of infection. But we have them in the underarm region at the groin. So there's multiple lymph nodes, and lymph will pass in and out of multiple lymph nodes before it flows back to the subclavian veins. And hopefully we fought off infection in that lymph. Another organ, the thymus. And again, this is where the T and thymus-dependent lymphocytes comes from, the T and T cells. And what's unique about this organ is, again, this is the site where the T cells complete their full development. So their complete maturation occurring within this organ. And within the thymus, the T cells are truly now adapting to our unique genetic sequence, our unique cell markers. And to describe it kind of simply, the T cells that are within the thymus, they learn to recognize the traits of our own healthy tissue. So if T cells could learn to recognize the appearance of our own healthy tissue because they're being exposed to our own antigens, once they pass out and circulate through our bloodstream, they can now recognize foreign material. So we want the T cells to be completely developed and matured, to have that self-recognition before they ever have that release into circulation. We don't want them exposed to tissues before they have learned to adapt to our own healthy tissues. So what's known as this blood-thymus barrier, and that's exactly what it is. There's now this barrier between the thymus and the capillaries of the cardiovascular system. And again, we don't want to expose immature, the non-fully developed T cells to any of our natural antigens until they've learned to recognize our own healthy tissue. And that'll prevent the premature stimulation of immature T cells. The risk would be immature T cells might start to attack our own healthy cells. So we need to have them completely developed, sensitized to our own unique chemistry before they become activated. And that's the purpose of this blood-thymus barrier. And now about the organ itself, it has a change in size and a change in function throughout our lifespan. So in terms of very early in life, in infancy, this is when it has its highest level of activity, and this really makes sense. Like a baby is born, and early in life, they just have to develop their immune system. And this is boosted by, of course, vaccinations as that little kid's developing, and even breastfeeding. Breastfeeding, that's a direct transfer from the mother's milk to the baby, and that could help to boost the baby's immunity. And very early in life, the organ's very active. Also, relative to the size of a little baby, like a small size of a little infant, it's a proportionately big, large size thymus early in life. However, it's relative to the size of that little baby because we see it reaches its maximum size at puberty, And that would be similar to this illustration down here. So the maximum size produced. So reaching its maximum size at puberty, which is still relatively early in life, with advanced stage, as we get older, it actually starts to now decrease in size and shrinking down. And that's the kind of typical pattern of development. So shrinking with advanced stage. And the final organ we'll look at for this system is the spleen. So we have just one single spleen. It's to the left posterior side of our abdomen. The term would be retroperitoneal space. So towards the left posterior side of our abdomen. And just as a reference here, comparing it to the rib cage. So there's multiple areas of the spleen. You can see here from the histology the different stained areas. And these areas have distinct functions. So we'll start here with the regions. And we'll start here with this one called the white pulp. And there's that familiar term, lymphatic nodules. It's the white pulp region of the spleen that contains the lymphatic nodules. So meaning it contains a rich concentration of white blood cells. The spleen itself is an organ that gets a very rich blood supply. There's a lot of interaction with the cardiovascular system. And in fact, remember those sinusoidal capillaries? The sinusoidal capillaries with the biggest pores, one of the areas that contain them are the spleen. So the goal is blood that's circulating and interacting with the tissue of the spleen is exposed to these nodules, and hopefully we could fight off infection that's specifically in our blood, in our cardiovascular system, and that's the job of the white pulp. Whereas the second area, the red pulp, and we'll just switch colors quickly to highlight this. So the red pulp portion of the spleen, again, this has an interaction with the cardiovascular system with its rich blood supply. And this is one location where blood cells are ultimately broken down. Erythrocytes, leukocytes, even the fragment of platelets have their lifespan. And this is the area where abnormal, faulty, or just simply damaged blood cells are broken down in this red pulp region. So again, this is the anatomy, the organs for our lymphatic system. And as a whole, all of these organs, your tonsils, multiple lymph nodes, a single spleen, the Peyer's patches in the intestines, collectively their function makes up our immune system.